Well, late February, some Republican lawmakers booed and heckled their black Democratic counterparts on the House floor, a situation that turned nearly physical. Many black activists and assembly members say the incident was indicative of a greater problem, the lack of diversity within the General Assembly and state politics overall. Mitch Legan reports.
Representative Cherish Pryor was on the House floor last month when a debate over school choice turned to shouting.
You can boo if you want to.
I've been elected since 2008. We have had emotional discussions on a lot of issues, but nothing to the level of disrespecting another person in the institution.
When Pryor walks the State House halls, she doesn't see many people who look like her. Lack of diversity in government is something she's always been aware of, but the heckling incident brought the issue to the forefront.
There is a constant fight to have your voice heard sometimes.
Just 15% of Hoosiers are people of color, making Indiana one of the whiter states in the country. When you compare the state numbers to the demographics of the General Assembly, white Hoosiers are slightly overrepresented. They're 85% of the population and about 89% of legislators. Latino and Asian Hoosiers are underrepresented, while African Americans are about represented proportionally. But members of the state's Black Caucus say that doesn't mean much when the party in power is almost completely white.
It's only legislation from one perspective alone. It's not public policy from a wide variety of perspectives.
109 of 110 Republican legislators are white, so is every statewide elected official. With the GOP's commanding supermajority in the legislature, minority leaders feel their Republican counterparts often dismiss their concerns.
Until those particular issues arrive in the majority community, and then all of a sudden what we say then becomes relevant and true.
Indiana didn't have a hate crime law until a synagogue in Carmel was vandalized in 2018. The Black Caucus had been pushing for one for most of the decade. Pryor says having more diverse voices in power would create better legislation for all Hoosiers.
I don't necessarily cast as a problem, but it's certainly something that we need to improve upon.
Hupfer says in some cases, Republican policies on issues such as workforce development and child mortality have disproportionately helped some minority communities, and the party needs to do a better job of communicating its successes with those populations.
But we are starting, I think, to take meaningful steps to have authentic conversations and build authentic relationships where I think a path exists for some improvement over the next several years.
Members of the Black Caucus say those conversations could take place at the State House, where their concerns have historically fallen on deaf ears. For years, they had been pushing for police reform. The General Assembly finally passed a reform bill this session, but only after mass demonstrations for racial justice over the summer.
So many issues that affect the minority, and I'll say the African American community in particular. And when we say this is a problem, this is a crisis, this is how we need to resolve these issues, it's really swept under the rug.
The GOP has hired its first director of diversity and inclusion and began a diversity leadership series to increase engagement and prepare minority Republicans to run for office. But just this week, the party caucused in Evansville to choose a replacement for former Representative Holly Sullivan, the new Secretary of State. The caucus went with local real estate broker Tim O'Brien. Venezuelan immigrant Alfonso Vidal didn't make it past the first round of voting.
It's going to be a process. We didn't get here overnight. It won't change overnight.
About 7 miles west of the State House, Brian Chatfield is taking it upon himself to change what the typical Hoosier politician looks like, starting at the local level.
As I got on the campaign trail, I had these biases myself, like, oh, these folks, they don't want to listen to me. They're going to see this black guy and turn away. But that wasn't the case.
He'll spend the second Thursday of each month at the Wayne Township government offices as a new advisory board member. He's committed to helping his district. But if the state party ever saw him as State House material, he says he'd have to consider.
You can't really impact institutional racism or even issues in institutions unless you have a seat at the table.
They say all politics is local. For now, Chatfield's hoping the State House will follow suit. Maybe one day he'll be there himself. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Mitch Legan.
Indiana Republicans have not acted on Democrats' calls for censors and implicit bias training following the incident.